In the heart of Nandora, a city alive with energy and ambition, the streets hum with life. Towering glass skyscrapers reflect the sun, casting light over the colourful market stalls below. Vendors call out their prices, children weave through the crowds with laughter, and the smell of grilled maize mixes with the scent of freshly baked bread. It's a city that never slows down, a place where dreams are chased and sometimes lost. Omari is one of those dreamers who made it. He built his empire from scratch, rising from a small-time merchant to the proud owner of a chain of thriving electronics shops. People respect him, admire him even, but they fear him too. He's known for his sharp tongue, his ruthless business deals, and his temper that flares like a spark in dry grass. In public, he walks tall, dressed in fine suits and expensive shoes, a man who commands attention. Beside him stands Zalika, though she seems like she belongs to a different world. She's warm and kind, with eyes that hold a quiet strength. She runs a small, cozy community library, tucked away in the market's quieter corner, where she teaches children to read and helps struggling families. The people of Nandora adore her. She remembers everyone's names, checks on the sick, and even gives away books to children who can't afford them. To the community, she's a light, a reminder that kindness still exists in a city that sometimes feels too fast and too cruel. But behind the closed doors of their grand home, things aren't as perfect as they seem. Once, Omari and Zelik were deeply in love. He wasn't always this cold, and she wasn't always this distant. They used to laugh together, dream together. Omari loved how Zelik saw the world, her hope, her warmth, her unwavering belief in people. And Zelik loved his ambition, his drive to give them a better life. Over time, though, success changed him. The weight of his business, the pressure to keep growing, and the fear of losing everything hardened Omari. He started snapping at Zelik more often, blaming her when things didn't go right. He saw her kindness as a weakness, her library as a distraction from what he believed really mattered: power, status, money. Zelik tried to hold on to the man she fell in love with, hoping he would find his way back to her. But with every argument, every cold glance, every night spent in separate rooms, that hope grew smaller. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep waiting for the man she once knew to return. In Nandora, people whispered about their marriage, how a woman so full of light ended up with a man who seemed to be drowning in his own darkness. But Zelik never spoke badly about Omari. She carried her pain quietly, hiding it behind her warm smile. She believed in him, even when he stopped believing in himself. Omari, though, couldn't see the love he was pushing away. All he saw was his growing business, his mounting stress, and the nagging feeling that Zelik was no longer on his side. He didn't realize that the more he tried to control her, the further she drifted from him, and the closer they came to a moment that would change everything. The market was alive that afternoon, as it always was. Caribou Market never rested. The air buzzed with life, laughter, and the sounds of vendors calling out their deals. The smell of sizzling meat and sweet roasted corn filled the air as people shuffled from stall to stall. Children darted between the crowds, giggling, while women bartered for the freshest vegetables. It was a place where the city's heart beat loud and fast. But that day, the heartbeat stopped. Omari arrived, his usual proud stride faster than normal, his jaw tight with frustration. His phone call had ended badly, another business deal lost. His temper boiled over. He didn't see the market's colors, the people, or the worried look on Zelik's face as she walked beside him. All he saw was failure. And in his mind, Zelik was the reason for it. "You're always wasting time with those children and those useless books," his voice thundered, loud enough for heads to turn. "While I'm out here trying to build something real, you're too busy playing the neighborhood saint." Zelik's face tightened, but she stayed calm. She stepped closer to him, lowering her voice. "Omari, please, this isn't the place. Let's go home. We can talk." Her voice was soft, steady, the same voice that used to comfort him when nothing else could. But today, it felt like oil on fire. "Don't tell me where to talk," he barked, his voice cut through the noise like a blade. "I'm tired of you embarrassing me. People look at me like I'm weak because of you, because you'd rather be a charity worker than a wife." The crowd began to quiet. Stalls that had been filled with laughter fell into an uneasy hush. People paused in mid-bargain, their eyes flicking toward the escalating argument. Zelik's cheeks flushed, but she didn't flinch. She looked at him, her voice still calm but firmer now. "Omari, I'm not trying to make you look weak. I'm trying to help people. That's not something to be ashamed of. Omari wasn't listening. His anger was too loud inside him. All he could think about was how everyone was watching, judging. He felt their eyes on him like daggers. He felt small, and Omari hated feeling small. Before he even realized what he was doing, his hand swung. The slap echoed through the market, louder than the vendors, louder than the chatter, louder than everything. Zalika stumbled back, her head snapping to the side. The world seemed to freeze. The market fell into a dead, unnatural silence. No one moved. People stared, their faces frozen in shock. A woman covered her mouth. A man shook his head slowly. Children stopped mid-play, wide-eyed and confused. Even the vendors, who usually argued and shouted over each other, stood still, their goods forgotten. Omari's chest heaved, his face red with anger, but the silence felt heavier than his rage. He looked around and saw what he had done reflected in their faces: disgust, disappointment, disbelief. The respect he once commanded was gone. Zalika didn't cry. She didn't yell. Slowly she lifted her head. Her cheek burned, but her eyes didn't. They stared at Omari, not with fear, but with something far worse: sadness. Without a word, she turned and walked away. The crowd parted for her like the sea. No one dared to stop her. Omari stood there, frozen. The silence stretched on, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly powerless. The market, once filled with life and laughter, now felt like a different place. The air, once warm and vibrant, turned heavy and cold. People didn't know where to look. Some turned their heads away, pretending they hadn't seen what just happened. Others stole quick, uneasy glances at Omari and Zalika. The whispers began, low and hushed, like the wind moving through the stalls. "Did you see that?" one woman murmured. "He hit her. His own wife," another voice whispered, horrified. "Omari! No one stands up to him. He owns half the market," someone else muttered nervously. Fear clung to the air like smoke. Omari wasn't just a man. He was powerful, respected, and feared. He wasn't someone you crossed. People remembered how he crushed his business rivals, how he always got his way. No one wanted to be his next target, so they looked away, hoping the moment would pass, hoping someone else would speak up. But not everyone stayed silent. From the crowd, a voice rose. It was shaky, young, but bold enough to cut through the tension. "She's your wife, not your punching bag." All eyes turned to the source. A young vendor named Amina. She was barely more than a teenager, her hands still dusted with flour from the bread she had been selling. Her voice trembled, but her eyes didn't. They burned with anger, with the kind of courage only someone who's seen too much pain too young can carry. Omari's head snapped towards her, his face twisted, disbelief flashing to fury. How dare this girl, a nobody, a street vendor, challenge him, humiliate him in front of everyone? His pride burned hotter than his shame. Without thinking, without hesitation, he stormed toward her. "Stay out of this!" he barked, his voice like a crack of thunder. Amina didn't move. She swallowed hard, her hands shaking, but she didn't back down. "She doesn't deserve this," she said, quieter now, but still steady. "No woman does." Omari didn't want to hear it. His anger exploded. He shoved her aside, not hard enough to hurt her, but enough to make her stumble backward. The crowd gasped. Amina fell into a stack of crates, the sound of wood splintering breaking the thick silence. No one moved to help her. The fear was too strong. Omari didn't stay to see if she got back up. His face was red, his chest heaving. He turned on his heel and stormed away, shoving past people like they weren't even there. The market parted for him, not out of respect, but out of fear. He didn't look back. He didn't see Zalika still standing there, alone. She didn't move. She didn't speak. Her cheek was still red, her eyes glassy, but she didn't cry. She stood there, silent and still, as though frozen in place. The humiliation hung on her like a weight too heavy to carry. The crowd didn't know what to do. People wanted to help, but no one dared. The fear of Omari's wrath was too strong. Some turned away completely, pretending they saw nothing. Others lingered, torn between their hearts and their fear. In the corner, near a dusty old fruit stall, an elderly man watched. His name was Baba Themba, an old storyteller, a man who had lived in Nandora longer than most of the market's vendors had been alive. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp despite his years. He had seen many things in his time. He knew that power, when left unchecked, could turn even the strongest men into monsters. His eyes narrowed as he watched Omari walk away, his face unreadable. He didn't speak, he didn't move, but there was something in his gaze, something heavy, knowing, and unspoken. The market slowly came back to life, but it wasn't the same. Laughter didn't return. Voices were quieter, more cautious. People looked at Zalika differently now, not with pity, but with sadness and helplessness. They wanted to do something. They wanted to help, but no one knew how. And Zalika, she didn't wait for anyone. After a moment, she turned and walked away, her head held high, her steps slow but steady. The crowd watched her go in silence, unsure if they were witnessing a woman breaking or a woman rising. Zalika stood there for a moment, her cheek burning and her heart aching in a way that words couldn't describe. The market around her felt distant, like it wasn't even real anymore. The sounds of people whispering, the weight of their eyes on her, it all blurred into a low hum in the back of her mind. But she didn't cry. She didn't let the tears come, even though they begged to. She wouldn't give them, or Omari, that satisfaction. Slowly, she lifted her head. Her body felt heavy, but her spirit refused to bow. Her eyes, usually so full of warmth and kindness, were different now. They were steady, filled with a quiet strength that no slap, no humiliation could ever take from her. She wasn't going to break, not here, not now. The market was frozen, watching her. Vendors who had been laughing moments ago now stared in stunned silence. Shoppers held their bags tighter, unsure of what to do. Children, sensing the tension but not fully understanding it, clung to their mothers' skirts. No one spoke, no one moved. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting to see what Zalika would do next. She didn't look at Omari. She didn't give him one more second of her attention. He wasn't worth it. He had already taken enough from her, her pride, her dignity, the love she once believed could withstand anything. She wouldn't let him take her strength too. Without a word, Zalika turned and walked away. Her steps were slow but steady, each one more powerful than the last. Her head stayed high, her back straight. She didn't rush, didn't falter. The crowd parted for her as she moved, people stepping aside as if they weren't sure whether they should help her or let her go. Some reached out, but no one spoke. There was something unspoken in the air, a deep, shared understanding that this wasn't a moment for pity. Zalika didn't need their sadness. She wasn't a victim to be pitied. She was something more than that now. The whispers started again, quieter this time, more thoughtful. How does she still stand so tall after that? One voice murmured. She's stronger than I would be, another admitted. She didn't even cry, someone else whispered, almost in awe. The people watched her, not with judgment anymore, but with a strange, aching sort of respect. They had expected tears, maybe even begging, something that made sense after what they had just witnessed. But Zalika gave them none of it. She gave them strength instead. Baba Themba, the old man who had watched everything from the corner of the market, nodded slowly to himself. He saw something in her that the others didn't, something powerful, something unbreakable. He didn't say a word, but his eyes followed her until she disappeared from view. As Zalika walked deeper into the crowd, the market seemed to swallow her up, like the city itself was protecting her from the world. Her bright, familiar figure faded into the sea of people, and then she was gone. The market slowly came back to life, but it wasn't the same. The sounds returned. The vendors called out their prices again, but the laughter was quieter now, the smiles more hesitant. The image of Zalika walking away, head high and heart unbroken, lingered in their minds like a shadow that wouldn't leave. And somewhere, deep inside, a silent, unspoken truth settled over them all. Zalika wasn't the one who lost that day. Omari was. Omari returned home that night, his footsteps heavy against the marble floors of his grand, empty house. The silence inside felt louder than the noise of the market. He loosened his tie, tossing it aside, and made his way to the bar in the corner of the living room. The expensive bottles lined the shelves, sparkling under the dim lights. He didn't bother picking his favorite. He grabbed the nearest one and poured himself a glass. The whiskey burned his throat, but it didn't burn away the feeling in his chest. The humiliation from the market stuck to him like tar, thick and suffocating. He could still feel their eyes, hear their whispers. Worse than that, he could still see Zalika, the way she looked at him. Not with fear, not even with anger, with sadness. That look haunted him more than anything. He drank faster, hoping to drown the memory. Glass after glass until the room felt like it was swaying. His head felt heavy, his body sluggish. He stumbled toward the couch, collapsing into it with a heavy sigh. His eyes began to close, the alcohol pulling him under. The world blurred. Then he heard it, a whisper, software, almost too quiet to catch. Why, Omari? Why did you hurt her? His eyes snapped open. His heart thudded in his chest. the haze of alcohol lifting just enough to jolt him awake. He sat up, blinking hard. The room was still. The only sound was the distant hum of the city outside. His breath came fast and shallow. He looked around, but no one was there. His mind must be playing tricks on him, he thought. He rubbed his face and let out a shaky breath, trying to convince himself it was just the alcohol. But his skin crawled, and the room felt colder somehow. He shook his head and stood up, swaying slightly. He needed to sleep. Maybe everything would feel different in the morning. He turned toward the hallway, but something made him stop. The mirror. It hung on the wall near the staircase, tall, elegant, framed in gold. He had walked past it 1,000 times without thinking, but now his eyes were drawn to it. He didn't know why, but he couldn't look away. His reflection stared back at him, the way it always did. Same sharp suit, same tired eyes, but something felt off. He stepped closer, squinting. Then his blood ran cold. His reflection smirked. He wasn't smirking. His face was still, frozen in shock, but the face in the mirror twisted into a slow, mocking grin. His stomach clenched, a wave of ice rushing through his veins. He stumbled back, knocking over a small table. The crash echoed through the room, but the smirking reflection didn't flinch. Omari's breath came in shaky gasps now. His mind raced. This wasn't possible. Mirrors didn't do that. He squeezed his eyes shut, telling himself he was drunk, imagining things. When he opened them again, the smirk was gone. His reflection looked normal, confused and afraid, just like him. For a moment, he stood there, heart hammering against his ribs. The room was silent again, too silent. The air felt thick like it was pressing down on him. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. He turned away from the mirror, forcing himself to walk toward the bedroom. His steps felt slow, heavy, like the floor was pulling at his feet. His ears strained, listening for more whispers. There were none, but the weight in his chest didn't lift. The silence didn't feel safe. It felt like something was waiting, watching. Omari didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Omari woke up with a pounding head and an uneasy feeling that wouldn't go away. The house felt colder, emptier than usual. He barely remembered falling asleep, only that unsettling smirk in the mirror and the whispers that didn't sound like his own thoughts. Shaking it off, he got dressed like he always did, in his finest suit, and stepped outside. He told himself today would be better. It had to be. He walked through the streets of Nandora like he did every morning, heading to Karibu Market to check on his stores. The sun was bright, but the city felt different, off. People usually greeted him with forced smiles and nods, eager to stay on his good side. Not today. The first thing he noticed was the silence. It wasn't the usual lively hum of the market. Conversations died when he walked by. People didn't look at him. They looked away. Vendors who used to call him Boss Omari and offer him the best of their goods now turned their backs. A fruit seller who once practically begged him to take his mangoes pretended to rearrange his stall, eyes downcast. Omari stopped at his favorite tea vendor, a wiry man named Juma, who always had a steaming cup waiting for him. Juma wouldn't meet his eyes. He stared at the ground, his hands wiping the same spot on his cart over and over. Juma, Omari said, his voice low. The usual. Juma didn't move. After a moment, without looking up, he muttered, "I've got nothing for you." Omari blinked, caught off guard. "What did you say?" "I said," Juma repeated, louder this time, "I've got nothing for you." His voice wasn't angry. It was flat, like Omari wasn't even worth the effort. Omari felt his jaw tighten. He turned to walk away, but that's when he heard it, a child's voice, loud and clear. "That's him, the man who beat his wife." Omari froze. Slowly he turned his head. A group of children stood near a basket of maize, staring at him. One little boy pointed, wide-eyed. The other kids stared too, whispering to each other. They weren't afraid of him. They looked at him like he was a monster from one of Baba Themba's old stories. Omari's stomach twisted. He clenched his fists, willing his voice to stay calm. He wanted to shout at them, to tell them to stop staring. But what could he say? They weren't wrong. He kept walking, faster now. His own market stalls came into view, the pride of his business empire. But even there, things weren't right. His employees, his most loyal workers, looked uncomfortable. One of his store managers, a man named Kato, who had worked for him for years, pretended to be busy stacking boxes. When Omari called his name, Kato didn't even look up. The customers were worse. People passed by his shop without stopping. Some glanced inside, saw him, and kept walking. Others didn't even bother to look. The usual crowds that filled his stores were gone. The only thing emptier than his house was his business. Omari's chest felt tight, his throat burned. He wanted to believe it would pass, that people would forget. But deep down, he knew better. Then, he saw him. Baba Themba. The old man sat in his usual spot near the market's entrance, his cane resting across his lap. His wrinkled face was calm, but his eyes, those sharp, knowing eyes, seemed to look right through Omari. He hadn't said a word since the day before, but now he spoke. His voice was low, steady, but it cut through the market like a knife. A man who strikes his wife strikes his own soul. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. People stopped what they were doing. Some nodded quietly. Others stared at Omari, waiting for him to say something, to defend himself. But he couldn't. His throat felt dry, his heart pounding in his ears. For the first time in his life, words failed him. He turned away, his steps quick and unsteady, leaving behind the market that once admired him, a market that now wanted nothing to do with him. That night, Omari couldn't shake the weight pressing down on him. The market's rejection replayed in his mind like a broken record. Every turned back, every whisper, every pointed finger echoed in his ears. He sat alone in his grand, hollow mansion. A house that once felt powerful, now felt like a prison. The silence wrapped around him, thick and suffocating. He poured himself another drink, hoping to quiet his racing thoughts. The amber liquid burned his throat, but it did nothing to ease the gnawing pit in his stomach. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for just a moment. Then he heard it again, the whisper, clearer this time. "Why, Omari? Why did you hurt me?" His eyes snapped open. His heart pounded hard against his chest. He looked around, breath shaky. The room was empty, but the voice still hung in the air, cold and distant. He knew that voice. He could never forget it. Zalika. He swallowed hard, trying to convince himself he was imagining things. But the house felt wrong, like the walls were closing in on him. He stood up, pacing. His footsteps echoed louder than they should have. He caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror across the room. His reflection stared back, but something felt off again. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. Then he saw it. Behind him, in the reflection, stood Zalika. She wasn't supposed to be there. She wasn't there, but the mirror showed her, standing silently. Her eyes weren't full of warmth anymore. They were hollow, sad, and full of something deeper. Disappointment, pain. Omari spun around, his breath caught in his throat. But the room was empty. No one was there. His heart hammered against his ribs. He turned back to the mirror, and Zalika was gone. His own reflection stared back at him, his face pale and sweaty. He stumbled away from the mirror, his mind racing. He wasn't drunk enough for this. He wasn't even sure he was awake anymore. The room felt colder, the air thicker. His throat tightened. He needed to sleep. Maybe sleep would fix this. He made his way to his bedroom, his legs feeling heavier with each step. The hallway felt longer than before, stretching endlessly. The shadows seemed darker, the corners of the house unfamiliar. He finally reached his bed and collapsed onto it, his body aching. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing himself to breathe slowly. Sleep. He just needed sleep. But the whispers didn't stop. "Why? Omari, why did you hurt me?" The voice was closer now, almost in his ear. He covered his head with his hands, squeezing his eyes shut tighter. Go away, he muttered to himself, his voice trembling. Then came the worst sound of all, laughter. It wasn't Zalika's voice anymore. It was his own voice, but twisted and cruel, echoing through his head. He shot up, gasping for air. His heart slammed in his chest. His eyes darted around the room, empty, silent. But then he saw the mirror again. His reflection wasn't his anymore. The man in the mirror looked like him, but he was battered, bruised, and bleeding. His eye was swollen shut, his lips split, and his face twisted in pain. He looked like someone who had been beaten half to death. Omari stared, frozen in horror. He touched his own face, but it was smooth and unmarked. The man in the mirror, though, he stared back with wild, accusing eyes. Omari screamed. The sound ripped through the house, but no one was there to hear it. Zalika sat quietly in the warm, comforting glow of her grandmother's small hut on the edge of Nandora. The air smelled of herbs and wood smoke, and the soft crackling of the fire filled the silence. Mama Abeni, her grandmother, moved gracefully around the room, her old hands steady as she ground herbs in a wooden bowl. She was a woman of wisdom, respected throughout the city for her knowledge of both medicine and the spirit world. Zalika had come here after the market, after the slap that echoed not just on her cheek but in her heart. She hadn't cried. She didn't feel broken, just empty. Mama Abeni hadn't asked questions when she arrived, only opened her arms and held her. Now, days later, Zalika finally spoke. "I loved him once," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But the man I loved isn't there anymore." Mama Abeni looked at her with eyes full of understanding. She set her herbs aside and sat beside Zalika, taking her hands gently. "A woman's strength isn't in silence, child," she said, her voice low and steady. "It's in knowing when to walk away." Zalika felt her throat tighten. The words hit something deep inside her, something she hadn't wanted to face. For so long, she believed enduring Omari's anger was a sign of loyalty, of love. But now, hearing her grandmother's words, she realized staying had only made her lose pieces of herself. Mama Abeni leaned closer, her voice softer now, but filled with a quiet power. "You are not weak, Zalika. You are not broken. The world teaches women to endure, but sometimes the strongest thing we can do is leave the ones who hurt us. You walked away. That is your strength." Zalika's eyes burned with unshed tears. For the first time in days, she felt something other than pain. She felt hope. After a long silence, Mama Abeni spoke again. Her voice was different this time, lower, more serious. "Omari's heart is poisoned by his own pride, but he will learn." Zalika looked at her grandmother, confused. "What do you mean?" Mama Abeni's eyes didn't waver. "I placed a Roho Mbovu curse on him, the curse of the broken soul." Her voice was calm, but there was weight in her words. "It is not a curse of harm, it's a curse of truth. It forces the cruel to feel the pain they've caused. He will feel what you felt. Every hurt, every humiliation. His heart will carry the weight of his actions until he understands the damage he's done." Zalika stared at her grandmother, speechless. A part of her felt shock, but a deeper part of her felt relieved. She wasn't sure if it was right to feel that way. "Mama, what if he never understands? What if he never changes?" Mama Abeni smiled softly, brushing a hand over Zalika's hair, like she did when she was a child. "Then his soul will remain broken. But that is no longer your burden to carry, Zalika. His pain belongs to him now, not you." Zalika felt something lift from her chest. For the first time in what felt like forever, the weight she'd been carrying wasn't hers anymore. She wasn't responsible for Omari's anger, his cruelty, or his redemption. She was free. Omari wandered the streets of Nandora like a ghost. His once proud shoulders were slumped, his expensive clothes wrinkled and dirty. He didn't care. The market, his business, his reputation, none of it mattered anymore. He was haunted, broken, and utterly alone. The whispers didn't stop. His own reflection tortured him. Sleep was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Zalika's face, heard her voice, felt her pain. Days blurred together, each one heavier than the last. The city that once respected him now treated him like a stranger. No one met his eyes. The market vendors ignored him. Even the children who used to wave at him now ran away. He was a man without a home, a heart, or a purpose. Finally, with nothing left to lose, Omari knew what he had to do. He had to find Zalika. He asked everyone he could, but no one would help him. It was Baba Themba, the old man from the market, who finally told him where she was. His voice was low and firm. "She's with Mama Abeni. If you truly seek her, Omari, then you better bring more than just words." Omari didn't hesitate. He walked for hours, his legs aching, his throat dry. The sun burned his skin, but he kept going. When he finally reached Mama Abeni's hut, he was covered in dust and sweat. His once powerful frame looked smaller, weaker. His heart pounded harder than it ever had before, not from the walk, but from fear. Zalika stepped out of the hut. She looked different, stronger. Her eyes weren't filled with pain anymore. They were calm, steady, and distant. Omari's knees buckled. He dropped to the ground in front of her. His voice trembled. "I was a fool, Zalika. I hurt the one person who loved me most. I don't deserve you, but I'll spend my life making it right. Please, forgive me." His voice cracked, and his eyes burned with tears. He wasn't the powerful businessman anymore. He wasn't the feared man of the market. He was just a broken man who had lost everything, especially her. Zalika didn't speak right away. She stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but unshakable. "Love without respect isn't love at all, Omari." Her words hit him like a hammer. "If you truly want me back, you have to prove you've changed, not with words, but with who you choose to become." Omari's throat tightened. He nodded slowly, tears streaming down his face. He knew she was right. Words weren't enough. He had a long road ahead, and he would walk it, no matter how long it took. Months passed, and the man who once walked through Nandora's market with his head held high in arrogance, now moved through it with quiet humility. Omari, once feared and admired for his wealth, now wore simple clothes, his hands rough from work. He no longer barked orders or demanded respect. He earned it, little by little. He worked alongside the very people he once looked down on. He helped the vendors set up their stalls at dawn, his muscles aching from hauling sacks of produce and crates of goods. He carried water, swept the streets, and accepted the same small wages as everyone else. There was no special treatment. He didn't ask for any. Amina, the brave young vendor he once pushed aside, was among the first to notice his change. Her shop had been falling apart for months, barely holding together with old planks and hope. One morning, Omari showed up with wood and tools. He didn't say anything. He just started rebuilding. She watched him work in silence, unsure whether to believe what she was seeing. When the shop stood strong again, Omari wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked at her. "I'm sorry, Amina, for everything." His voice was low, but sincere. For a moment, Amina said nothing. Then she nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but steady. The market noticed. The whispers that once followed him, the ones filled with judgment and disgust, began to shift. He didn't stop there. He took the money from his once successful business and donated to the community library Zalika loved so dearly, the same library he once called a waste of time. He bought new books and helped repair the roof. He sat with the children Zalika used to read to, helping them sound out words. People watched, people talked, and slowly, Nandora began to forgive him. One quiet afternoon, as Omari stacked books in the library, he felt a familiar warmth behind him. He didn't turn around right away, afraid it was just another cruel trick of his mind. But this time, it wasn't. Zalika stood there, watching him. She'd returned, her eyes searching his face, not with anger, but with something else, curiosity, maybe even hope. Omari's throat tightened. He swallowed hard and walked toward her. His voice, steady but vulnerable, filled the quiet space between them. "I've learned that strength isn't control," he said softly. "It's kindness, it's respect, and it's loving without hurting. If you'll have me, I want to build a better life, one where we stand together." For a moment, Zalika didn't say anything. Then, slowly, a smile tugged at her lips. A real, genuine smile, the kind he hadn't seen in so long. She nodded. Without a word, they left the library, walking side by side through the market, not as a man and his wife, not as the broken pieces of what they used to be. They walked together, as equals, ready to build something new.